Jonah 4 is an interesting chapter, an interesting text to preach from. See, it's already offended someone who's leaving. Sorry, I have to pick on Nathan every once in a while. No, it's an interesting chapter to preach on, because if you go to children's libraries, Christian libraries, and you find the typical Jonah cardboard, often fold-out book, I will bet, I grew up in a Christian home and I experienced this as a child, but if you're a parent and if you've ever had to read Jonah to a child, you will see this. Almost all of the Jonah children books end in chapter 3. Because that's where we apparently get a neat, beautiful little happy end to the story. God relented, everyone was forgiven, and supposedly everyone is happy at the end of the story. The end. Let's now move on to chapter 4. But the wonderful thing about the story is chapter 4 isn't merely an appendix at the end of the story. It's not an epilogue. It's the whole point of the story. The story literally makes no sense and has no real power without chapter 4. The problem is chapter 4 can feel like an anticlimax. It can feel discouraging. It can seem really strange, awkward, uncomfortable. But that's the point. It's supposed to get under your skin. And so let me encourage us to not allow any version of the story to to blunt the edge of this knife. It's supposed to cut deep. And I want you to really consider this, because the thing about the story is, it is this last little episode, this last little scene, is that it's strange, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable, but it's also powerful because it shows us that this is a story principally about God working in the heart of a man. And in so doing is also, more ultimately, a powerful revelation of the heart of God himself. And we miss that completely. So as I did, really in some sense we can't lose sight of what's just happened in chapter 3. You saw this last week. But a quick reminder, the rebel prophet Jonah, who's been running from his call, reluctantly, apparently as we know in light of chapter 4, goes to this great city, this major city of this major empire of the time, the Assyrian Empire, to Nineveh, and he preaches this message of doom and gloom, fire and brimstone. In 40 days, the city will be overturned, flipped over like a pancake, destroyed. Okay? There's no offer of hope. The king hears of this message. He believes this message. He proclaims a fast. He calls on everyone to repent, to turn to God. Everyone does it. Everyone believes the message, and God relents. And you would think that Jonah would be overjoyed. I mean, not even Billy Graham in the height of his ministry saw success like this. The entire city turned to God and away from their evil. But what's interesting is verse 1 of chapter 4, it displeased Jonah exceedingly. So the first section I want us to consider, the first idea that appears in verses 1 to 4 here, is we see anger over mercy. We see Jonah is angry over mercy, about mercy. So Jonah has a prayer meeting. He's angry. He has a prayer meeting in verse 2. He prayed to the Lord, and notice what he says. He says, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was yet in my country?" It's interesting because when you read chapter 1, it's very interesting. Other than Jonah's prayer in chapter 2, up until this point, you do not see Jonah and God talking to each other. God speaks to Jonah in Jonah chapter 1, but we don't see any dialogue. We don't see any verbal response from Jonah. Jonah prays, but we see no verbal response from God. Okay? Then God comes to Jonah again in chapter 3, verse 1, but we see no verbal response from Jonah. This is the first time that Jonah and God, we see the dialogue. We see log, as in we see them talking one to the other, but we never see them going back and forth until chapter 4, What's interesting is we learned something about chapter 1 in chapter 4 that we didn't know about, which is it wasn't that Jonah got a word from God and then he just quietly left for Tarshish. It turns out that he had spoken to God. And he says, is this not what I said? I said this to you when I was yet in my country. This is why I left to Tarshish. This is why even though you called me to essentially modern-day Baghdad, I flew to Iberia. I flew to Spain, right? I flew to Barcelona, or I took a boat to Barcelona, okay? This is why. This thing that has just happened, that the Ninevites have repented and have been spared disaster, is the reason that I already had told you that I wasn't going to do this. And it's very interesting, you know, I remember as a teenager for the first time seeing the Sixth Sense. I don't know if you've seen it. You could say this about The Sixth Sense or other movies like The Usual Suspects. There's a few movies like this. A lot of movies have a plot twist at the end of the story, right? A surprise. You know, the movie is moving along. You think you know what it's about, and then at the end it's like, wow, this person is really that person, or really the situation is this other situation that you hadn't foreseen. But there's a particular kind of movie where the surprise at the end of the film is so dramatic, you realize the film is not what you thought it was. In fact, the surprise at the end of the film is so dramatic that if you then go back and see the movie again, you have a totally different experience. You realize, I thought the movie was about A, the movie was about B. I won't spoil the end of The Sixth Sense, but let me encourage you to watch it. It's been over 20 years, right? I think I've even referenced it before. This story is like The Sixth Sense or The Usual Suspects. It's not just that there's a surprise at the end, it's that the surprise changes the whole way you read the entire story. Jonah is not running away from God because he's scared. He's not running away from God because it's too hard. He's not running away from God because he simply has no interest in obeying this text or doing what needs to be done. He has been running from God precisely because he knew God might forgive a people as evil and wicked as the Ninevites, and he doesn't want God to. It's so powerful when you look at it carefully. Look at chapter 3, verse 9. The king hears this message. He sends out a proclamation. Everyone repent. Everyone change your life. Fast. Stop eating. Put on sackcloth. Cry out to God. Plead with God to be merciful. And in chapter 3, verse 9, please look at this. The king says, who knows? Remember we saw that last week. Who knows? God may turn, and he may relent, and he may turn from his fierce anger that we may not perish. Who knows? Chapter 4, verse 2, Jonah says, I knew. Did you pick that up? Who knows? I knew. That's the point of the story. Jonah knew this could happen. Jonah says, that is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew. What did he know? What is the information that Jonah knows that the Ninevites do not know? He didn't get a prophecy that God was going to save them. That's not what he had. It's not that God said, hey, go and preach to them this message, and if they repent, I'm going to save them. God hadn't told him that. What he knows is not what God was going to do, for sure. He knew who God was. I knew that you are, this is identity language, a gracious God. I knew you are a merciful God. I know that you're a God who is slow to anger. I know that you're a God who abounds, overflows. This is like a fountain that doesn't stop overflowing in faithful love, unbreakable, unshakable, steadfast love. Because Jonah is a prophet. He knows the Old Testament. He's read up. When God reveals himself for the first time, really profoundly, to Moses. Moses had been the leader of Israel who had led Israel out of slavery in Egypt. When Moses asked to know who this God is in the book of Exodus, God reveals himself precisely with that language. He says, I am gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. It's even more so when Moses later, he goes up into the mountain and he wants to see God's glory. He wants to see God in his absolute purest, radiant beauty and holiness. God says, look, if I do that, you're going to burn. It's like a mosquito to the flame. You're just going to get zapped. You're not going to be able to handle it. But what we can do is I'm going to hide you behind this rock. I'm going to cover you up, and you're going to peek through a tiny hole, essentially, and you're going to see, I'm going to take some sort of form, and you're going to see me as I go past you, and you're going to see my back. Okay? It's a very mysterious passage. But as this happens, as Moses gets this tiny fragment view of the back of God, as it were, he hears voices proclaiming over and over again that God is a gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love God. In other words, this gets to the very core of who he is. It's not a side aspect or one among many aspects of who God is. At the very core of his glorious, radiant holiness and beauty is the fact that he is a God of grace and mercy. That he is a God of love and an unbreakable love. That is why the Apostle John, a follower of Jesus in the New Testament, he says God is love. You never hear that God is justice. You hear that he's just. But you don't hear that he's justice. You hear that God is holy, holy, holy. But John defines love itself on God himself, or from God himself. God is the measuring rod, the canon, by which we can understand what love actually is. It's not what you see in a Disney movie or in a romantic comedy. It's by the God of the Scriptures. And the problem for Jonah is that he knew this about God. And so he said, even if there's the tiniest chance that these people would actually react to this message, there is a chance that they could turn and experience his steadfast love. Which means the issue with Jonah is he doesn't want them to experience God's steadfast love. Now this can be hard for us to understand, but we need to think again, to whom was this book written? It was not written for the Ninevites. Okay? It was written for the people of God at the time, Israelites. It was written to people like Jonah. It was written for people like Jonah. People who knew their scriptures, knew their history that we find in the Old Testament in our Bibles. But people who, during Jonah's time, people who were spiritually dormant, people who were spiritually askew, people who were not faithfully following the God of the Bible, but they were kind of following the God of the Bible, but they were also kind of doing their own thing. Especially the people of the northern tribes of Israel, which were Jonah's people. They weren't even going and worshiping God in the temple. They had sort of set up their own parallel worship system, and things were a mess. But for Jonah, they're still God's people. They're still the people that God had chosen to have a relationship with. And God has given them the scriptures, and God has revealed himself to them, and he's given them the law, and he's shown them how to worship him and how to approach him. And yet, they are not listening. Am I making sense? It's like the church, okay? You have essentially the church of the Old Testament. They have all this information about who God is and who they are and what they need to do. They have it. The Gentiles, the nations outside of Israel, do not have this information. They have it. The people outside of Israel do not know, but they know. And knowing, they're not doing anything about it. Am I making sense? They're not turning to God. They're not following God. They don't love God. But on top of all that, there is this empire, this Assyrian empire, which is the worst of all people of that time, wicked and evil and violent. And this other empire is a threat to the Israelites. They're threatening to destroy and crush the Israelites. These are evil people, okay? Don't think about your nice neighbors who are really sweet and kind. Maybe they don't follow Jesus, but no. These are people who are out to do the absolute worst possible to humanity. And Jonah says, what if they turn? And what if they experience God's steadfast love? Well, my people, who know way more information about this God and should know better, are not responding. Am I making sense? Can you see why? I'm not trying to defend Jonah, but I'm trying to show that Jonah isn't a cartoon. There's a logic to his anger, to his fury, to his frustration. It's like, well, what about us, God? And And why are you treating them fairly? And what, he's thinking about his own people, the state of his nation. And it's hard, Jonah's thinking, no fair. This is something that we should have. This is something that we should experience. And the challenge remains with us today. There are people doing very evil things. Just a few years ago, we saw those images that went all over the internet of, ISIS gunmen, faces covered, Christians, Egyptian Christians in orange jumpsuits, kneeling on the sand as their crimes against Allah were announced, and as they were shot down on that earth. And it's like, well, what if some ISIS guy, what if the ISIS terrorists have done that? What if they come to Christ? But then I turn around and the church in the West continues to show total disinterest in Christ and in the gospel message. And what about people who hate me or hate what I believe? How am I supposed to feel about them? Jonah here is angry about God's mercy. He's angry over God's mercy. But he also gets angry over circumstances. Look at verses 5 to 9 towards the end. Jonah gets angry about plants and worms and sunburn. Look at verse 5. Jonah, and this section ends in verse 4. The Lord says, Jonah's so angry, he's like, just kill me, God, just kill me now. Just end me now. And the Lord doesn't end Jonah. The Lord says, ask him a question. Do you do well to be angry? Essentially, he's asking Jonah, are you in the right in this situation, Jonah, in being angry? It's funny, God rarely directly tells us something. We see this in the ministry of Jesus. What God is really good at is asking us good questions that make us think. Okay, so Jonah doesn't answer. He doesn't say, well, you know what, God, really I need to look at this from a different perspective. He just leaves. Verse 5, he doesn't answer God. He goes out of the city and he makes a booth for himself. He has somehow a view of Nineveh. He sat under it in the shade till he could see what would become of the city. So, maybe he's thinking, hey, maybe something's still going to happen, or maybe they'll stop repenting or something, and God will, he still is absolutely committed to hopefully seeing the Ninevites end poorly. Then we see in verse 6 that the Lord appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, so sort of like this plant that comes over his head, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So apparently there was, he must have been bald or had a little bald spot, and so he's getting sunburn. He didn't have good sunblock at the time, I guess. But God creates this. Look at this simple story. It's a simple image. He allows this plant to grow and cover his head. It's interesting. God had sent the storm to stop Jonah from going to Tarshish. Then God had sent the whale to save Jonah from drowning. Then God had told the whale to spit Jonah out on dry land. And now God provides a plant to provide shade for Jonah. It's a simple touch. But Jonah really likes it. He says Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. Jonah loves the plant. Now look at what happens here. God continues to work sovereignly through the circumstances. When dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. So God provides this plant, gives shade for Jonah, but then God provides a worm that eats the plant, or at least attacks the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. In other words, he got a really bad sunburn on his bald spot, essentially, right? And felt sick, right? He was dehydrated, sunburned. So Jonah is just miserable. These people have turned. God has not destroyed them. They've experienced God's steadfast love. God's trying to get me not to be angry about this. Then I'm sitting here waiting, hoping something might change. God allows his plant to come over. That's great. But then he kills the plant. I've got a sunburn. This is horrible. Okay? So he asks again, God, just kill me. I am miserable. Okay? He's frustrated. He's not getting his way. Now look at this. God uses all this as a sort of living, organic parable to teach Jonah something. And he appeals to Jonah's heart. And this is where we see mercy over anger. Right? Jonah's angry over God's mercy. Jonah's angry about his circumstances. But God reveals mercy that triumphs over anger. Okay, look at this. God takes Jonah to anger management therapy. Okay? He speaks to Jonah's heart. Look at verse 4. God had asked Jonah, do you do well to be angry? Okay, that's how it started. Jonah was angry that God had not destroyed the city. But now, Jonah is angry that God has destroyed a plant. Now, you're right to chuckle, because I think the story is meant to be sarcastic, ironic, humorous. He's angry that God did not destroy a huge city, for the time, a huge city. We hear about 120,000 souls. Furious. But then he's furious that God does destroy a plant. Okay? Yes, it is silly. That's the point. So then God asks him, again, God asks him essentially a similar question, but in relation to the plant. In verse 9 he says, do you do well to be angry for the plant? Right? And you know the funny thing is? Jonah says, yes. I love the story. It's fascinating. Yes, I do well to be angry. I'm so angry that you killed a plant that I want to die. Now, it's silly, but come on, haven't you ever been in a situation where you get so mad that when you take a moment to breathe and take a break and take a 5-minute, 10-minute break, you come back and you go, I got very angry over something very stupid. I think we've all been there, right? Because what's really happening is Jonah's mad about something important, but he's venting about a plant, and God's highlighting this to him, right? The almost insanity that he would get so furious about a plant, but he's not angry about the possibility. He would be happy if God destroyed a city, right? That's what God is highlighting to Jonah. So look at God's wisdom. Look at the punchline of the story. Look at verse 10. God says, okay, let's think about this carefully, Jonah. You pity the plant for which you did not labor. You didn't even plant the plant, right? You didn't even plant the seed of the plant. Nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And then he asked the question, which should be obvious, but isn't obvious to Jonah. And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from the left, and also much cattle, much wealth, much power? God links something that Jonah's having a hard time linking. And what God is showing Jonah is, in his anger, in his bitterness, his whole moral value scale, right? His whole moral worldview has become askew. And the thing about it is, this is what can happen to the human heart. It can even happen to the human heart of those who profess to follow Christ. There were many Christians in this nation 150 years ago who tried to argue from the scriptures that slavery was all right. There were many Christians who argued against him, don't get me wrong, but there were many Christians, or at least professing Christians, who fought hard to defend chattel slavery. There were many supposed reformed Christians who defended apartheid in South Africa. And that wasn't 150 years ago, that was just about 30. I'm not going to speak to the state of their souls. I'm going to say, this can happen to people who profess to follow the real God, the God revealed in Jesus Christ. Things can happen in history, in our lives, in our circumstances, with our emotions, that send us in a spiral where our worldview, despite being professing Christians, despite going to church, despite knowing the right theology, can get so warped and upside down. The Ninevites weren't evil. They were wicked. Their worldview was warped. They did deserve to be destroyed by God. Jonah's not wrong. That is what they deserved. Right? That's why God is gracious. It's not that God is exacting the justice that they deserve. He's refraining from pouring out his justice upon them. Now, why he can do that and still be just has to do with what the New Testament is about. We'll get there in a minute. But Jonah's right that God is not enacting justice upon the Ninevites. They deserve to be destroyed. It's true. But what God is highlighting in the heart of Jonah is your worldview is warped as well. You've lost your way as well. Even as a prophet of God, even as you know your Old Testament, something has happened along the way that has turned your mind, your values, your right understanding upside down. So much so that I need to have a plant come up into your life and have it die, and you get furious over a plant for you to get that you're more angry about a plant than about 120,000 souls. Does that make sense? God's allowing him to see, whoa, what's happening? What happened to me? But when I really think about it, I often find myself in that situation. I'm often more frustrated that my internet went down, that my neighbors don't know the Lord. I'm more frustrated that my political candidate didn't win than the people around me who do not know Jesus. That's ridiculous, that's absurd, that's insane, that's irrational, that's stupid. Yeah. I think I'm not that different from Jonah. And I suspect you might not be so different from Jonah either. Which is why Jonah was not written to the Ninevites, it was written to the people who say that they follow God, to remind us we can get really warped. We can get almost as lost as the Ninevites who do not know their right from their left. And that we need God to intervene in our life, and sometimes to use circumstances that are unpleasant, like a bad sunburn, to get our attention. And say, how have you been ordering your priorities lately? What is it that moves your heart? What is it that stirs your emotions? What riles you up? Are the right things? Because there are things that should rile us up. There are things that should make us angry or upset or hurting or happy. But what is making you angry, upset, sad, concerned? What is filling your mind? What are you passionate about? A couple of things I want us to think about as we close. Just some things to consider. Because this is what's interesting about the story of Jonah. God asks Jonah a very good question at the end, right? Should I not pity? In other words, it's a question of justice. Is it also not right? If you're going to pity a plant, is it also not right that I would pity a great city of 120,000 people who do not know their right from their left? Here's what's interesting about the story of Jonah. The end. We want the children's church happy ending where Jonah says, "You're right, God," and Jonah repented and went and embraced his Ninevite brethren. That's not how the story ends. It's blank, ... It's not the end, it's the end. And that's also the point of the story is we don't know how Jonah answered, because God's question to Jonah is God's question to us. Jonah is ridiculous in this story, but maybe we're a little ridiculous. You see, when what the author's doing? I want us to think about a few things as we close. And as we close this series in Jonah, I want to highlight a few things. Notice how God describes Nineveh. He says, that great city. You know what's fascinating? That's how Nineveh is described throughout the story. It's that great city. And what's fascinating is God says, yeah, it's that great city. I think that's fascinating. Cities are close to the heart of God. The story of the Bible begins in a garden and ends in a city, the New Jerusalem. It's a garden city. It's a city that has all the elements of Eden, but it's a great city. When God created the world in Genesis, He tells mankind, be fruitful, be multiply, and exercise dominion over this world. Now, obviously we understand right dominion, not destructive dominion, which is what we've done. But dominion, bring this world, bring order into this world, and flourishing in this world by carrying out your dominion over this world. And cities are an expression of that dominion. Yes, because we are fallen, because we've rebelled against God, it's where all the crime is, all the corruption is, where most of the pollution is. I understand that. But it's also where you get the access to the best medicine, where you get access to the best education. I mean, all of us have chosen to live in a city. Why? Because in God's heart and mind, cities, when you take out the fall, are an expression of, or potentially the expression of, human flourishing. What they end up being is places of destruction and human rebellion. But in God's heart, the purpose is not Nineveh, it's not Babylon, but it is Jerusalem, it is Zion. What I'm trying to say is, a lot of us Christians try to spend most of our times running away from the evil cities when God has pity on and loves cities and wants us to have pity on and love cities because there are people in them that are made in His image. It's the places where there's the highest concentration of people who are made, of creatures who are made in the image of God. So God has great love for cities. The other thing I want you to notice is, yes, we remember that Romans 1 tells us that God's wrath is revealed against mankind who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, right? They suppress the truth that they know about God and rebel against God. They exchange the truth of God for lies and rebel against God. Yes, that's true. But it is also true that in their dizzying spiral of ignorance and rebellion, God also has compassion on our lostness. He describes the Ninevites. I want you to think about this. Nineveh is at the same time the great city capital, mega city of the Assyrian Empire. And God says, yes, that great city. And He also says, they don't know their right from their left. This is the paradox of the fall. We are human. We are made in the image of God. We have this dignity that no other creature has. We have value. It's wonderful. And therefore we are responsible for our rebellion against God. And also, we're like lost fools who do not know right from left, upon whom God also has pity and compassion. So as believers, we can be upset, concerned with unrighteousness and evil in the world, but we should also have compassion on the lost. A lot of us are upset at the moral direction of our culture and the people who are caught up in that moral lostness, and that's right. But a lot of us are only angry and angry all the time. When what we see in God is compassion and pity at the ignorance of God that people have. I see a lot of angry Christians. I don't see a lot of compassionate Christians. A couple of things before we finish. I want you to notice one thing. Note that God cares as much about Jonah the individual as He cares about a great city of regional influence. It's not an either or. So God can say, make disciples of all the nations, and He cares about that personal problem that you're going through at the same time. He can handle both. In other words, In chapter 3, we see God's great compassion on Nineveh, the rebellious, wicked Gentile city. And then in chapter 4, we see God's amazing compassion and pity and grace with a rebellious prophet. It's both. Okay? He manages the great things of history and the universe, and also your individual issues. Second, God cares about Jonah specifically, and he isn't utilitarian. That is, he calls Jonah to a task. Jonah rebels against it. God gets him there, through storm and sea and fish. And Jonah gets there. He preaches the gospel. One that doesn't preach the gospel, he preaches judgment, sorry. There is a result. The people of Nineveh are saved. And then God doesn't go, okay, do what you will, Jonah. Jonah is one dude. 120,000 people have been rescued. Jonah is one dude who's mad. And God, the creator of the universe who sustains every atom in the universe, spends time speaking to this one rebel man and speaking to his heart and addressing his heart. What does that reveal about God to you? Do you get what I'm saying? Do you understand this? I'm saying, little you in your life, God cares as dramatically, as radically, as profoundly, as infinitely about your individual struggle as he cares for the United States of America or the salvation of the world. As much, as powerfully, as infinitely. Your little struggle. And no, but this is what's happening. No, your little struggle. God will stop, as it were, everything. He's infinite, but you get what I mean. To come and to speak and to address you where you are. God doesn't go, well, I just saved 120,000 people, and this prophet is upset. You know what? Forget you, Jonah. I'll move on. No. There goes God pursuing this idiot, which is gospel, which is good news for you and me, because that means he can pursue this idiot. And he does. And he does. And he does. Okay? Last thing I'll say here, there's a lot more, but we'll leave it there. Notice that God is working through the circumstances and asking questions of Jonah, and he's doing all this to move Jonah he's moving Jonah's heart, trying to get Jonah closer to his own heart. He's trying to show Jonah God's own perspective, God's heart for people, his own heart even for evil people like these. In other words, he wants to move Jonah from where he's at to a place that's close to where God is at, as it were. Am I making sense? As it were, God is over here in terms of his perspective regarding Nineveh. Jonah's over here, and God's spending the time necessary to pull Jonah here and to sync Jonah up with where he's at, that Jonah might have a heart like his heart. And did you know that this is God's priority for your life? God's priority for your life is not your commercial success. God's priority for your life is not your career. God's priority for your life is not that you would be respected, is not your reputation, or any of these things. His priority for you is that your heart would be like his heart. And if necessary, he'll get you thrown into a stormy ocean to get you there. So I know that a lot of things happen around us which seem like disaster. There's a storm. I've been thrown into the ocean. I've been swallowed by a fish. Okay, I got saved from the fish, but then all these people who I hate now got saved by God. Oh, I hate this. Well, I got a shade. Well, all these things are happening in Jonah. And the whole point of the story, this is why I'm saying this story, this episode is the climax of the story. The point is, the whole point is God's priority for Jonah is that his heart will be like his heart. Not that Jonah would be the most recognized prophet in Israel. Not that he would be appreciated and loved and adored by the kings. No, that you would be like me. Which is an important way for you to read and interpret all the circumstances in your life. How is God at work in your life to make your heart more like His? There's a little bit more that I wanted to say, but I think we're out of time. I'll just say this to close. God must really love Tampa, because the Tampa Bay area has quite a bit more people than 120,000. So how are we thinking about Tampa? How are we thinking about Lutz and Carrollwood and Northdale? And are these places on your heart? And are you praying for these places? Are you praying for your neighborhood? Are you praying for your neighbors? Are you praying for this region? Let's pray together.